So in case you haven't been to one of these before, the way it works is that we're going to have a talk first by John tonight. And then after that, we'll have time for a Q&A. If you do have any questions throughout and afterwards, please do feel free to put them in the chat. And as Robin indicated earlier, afterwards, you will have the chance, if you do want to also come on, if you just indicate that as well. Then great. So otherwise, I will hand over to John. I'm very excited for this talk, and it's a great pleasure to have John Fletcher here speaking today. He's a medieval reenactment enthusiast, and I think that's how you became interested in this topic specifically, I'm guessing, but I will let you take it away.
Okay, fantastic. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming on. As David said, I'm a reenactor, an amateur historian. I moved to the Southwest when I was 18. I moved to Plymouth for university. And having already done Viking reenactment, I thought, let's look at local things. And I found this really interesting history, this early medieval history of Cornwall and the Southwest in general that wasn't very well discussed or very well researched in some circles. So it's something I just kind of tumbled into. Hopefully today won't be too dry. I think it's interesting. By the time I'm finished speaking, hopefully you'll think it's interesting, or you'll have ignored me and my prattlings moving forward. Just bear with me and I will share my screen. So, yeah, so. Right, so just gives you a very brief overview of what we're going through. I'm not going to go through point by point, but essentially what I want to talk about today, I want to talk about the traditional narrative we have of this period of history, not just in the Southwest, but in Britain, some of the problems with that, and then look at specifically in the Southwest, in Cornwall and the areas that were under effectively the same control as Cornwall, what that actually might have looked like. I'll move on to the battle itself, and then we'll talk about the festival we're trying to organize for next year, hopefully, to celebrate the 1300-year anniversary. So, the traditional narrative of early medieval, late antique, whatever you want to call it, the end of Roman rule in Britain. And the traditional narrative is this kind of really apocalyptic image of the Romans leave and then life collapses, the town's empty, there are barbarians spilling in from the gates and everywhere else. We have these famous quotes that people trot out, look to your own defenses, the Roman emperor says. We have Angles, Jutes, and Saxons invading. And we have Gildas, who for a long time was our major source for this period, talking about the ruin and conquest of Britain, which, as book titles go, really tells you what's in there at the start. But is that what happened? I mean, it's very neat for one thing. You have the Romans leave and a new set of people come in and they sweep all before them, and then you get set up for your next period of history, whatever you want to next get onto. So if we go through this bit by bit, the sort of traditional narrative, and we can start to see the problems that come out from it. So look to your own defenses. That's this great famous quote, the Britons must look to their own defenses. Unfortunately, it's not about Britain at all. Honorius is actually referring to a region in Italy, which was having problems of its own. It got mistranslated by a Byzantine historian, and it's just kind of come down to us through the period since then. We actually know that in the period after this kind of cutoff point, the Romans are gone, Germanus, who's a missionary and a sort of Roman Catholic, as it would later become bishop, arrives in Britain, and he describes a fairly functional society, a society that is safe and prosperous enough that they're having arguments about ecumenical matters, as Father Ted would say. Specifically the rise of Pelagianism, which is a very obscure argument in Catholic history, if you want to look into it. It's not a society that's, burned down to cinders. It's not something that just collapsed without the Romans there. If we look specifically at the Southwestern Kingdom, which is called Damonia, we obviously have the fantastic finds at Tintagel. And if my pronunciation, by the way, is just going to be all over the shop. I'm originally from the United States, so I will put that out there now. Feel free to comment and correct as we go. But we have these fantastic finds of Roman amphora, which have come from North Africa and the East Mediterranean. which have arrived after the Roman conquest, after the Roman departure, sorry. And not only are they arriving with wine and oil and all these other goods that the Romans are still sending and clearly think there's a market for, they're being reused. The pictures you can see there, there's the shards of the amphora themselves, and then the item on the left are slate stoppers. These are locally manufactured to fit the amphora, to reuse them. So not only are you just buying in goods in the same way that pre-Roman conquest Gauls and Britons would have done, you still have enough of your own economy and your own thoughtfulness to then reuse them for your own purposes. So this is a society that's still functional at a very high level. We also have, finds of literacy. They're able to write and doodle. There are scribes who are bored enough that they are doodling things on slate pieces that then get thrown away in Latin. These are not people who are an imminent threat from their lives at every moment in this kind of way we would have considered previously. The other image there you have is the Virgilius Romanus. This is in the Vatican Library. It's a very beautiful copy of the stories of Virgil, essentially. What I've included is Ken Dark, who's an archaeologist, argues fairly convincingly, in my opinion, for a production in the southwest of Britain, specifically in Somerset, so a little bit further east than specifically Cornwall and Devon. What it shows is not only a lot of wealth around, because this is not only a manuscript that somebody said to stand there and write, but they've illustrated it. They've used expensive pigments to decorate it and to bring this up. It also shows, a fairly, from what we can tell from other research, accurate depiction of sort of late Roman military equipment. They're wearing lorica squamata, which is kind of scale armor. Their shield bosses are a bit more pointy than you find in later Viking age. This is clearly showing a society that still views itself and projects itself in a very late Roman way. It's not one that has just collapsed into barbarism the minute the legions have left. So if we go to the next part, and credit for the photo goes to Thanes of Mercia. If you are at all interested in early medieval reenactment and want to see things about the Anglo-Saxons, they are an excellent resource. There's this kind of idea, that this thing of this sweeping, like I said before, this sweeping monolith of Germanic invaders coming in, the Anglos, the Saxons, and the Jews. And you could say that, but the question for me, and this applies to a certain amount to the Romano-Britons they were interacting with, is if you walked up to them in the 5th century and said, oh, you're an Anglo-Saxon, they would look at you very strangely. Even if you said to them, you're an Anglo, you're a Saxon, you're a Jute, they would probably still look at you pretty strangely. That's not realistically how they define themselves. They might say, oh, actually, I'm a retainer of Hengist. I'm a follower of Wraithwall. They link themselves very strongly to their warlords or their leaders, some of who have Romano-British names. They would maybe call themselves other names. You have the kings of East Anglia, including Raedwald with his magnificent helmet from Sutton Hoo, they think, call themselves the Wolfingas. They have these other names with these historical associations that are very strong with them. Or the Wessex, who will become very important in our story in the southwest, they actually enter the record as the Gavis. They are that fairly late, even into the 8th century. It's still king of the Gavis. The idea of the kind of the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes comes to us from Bede. Bede is one of the Venerable Bede, great English historian, one of the big proponents for England, for English, or Anglish as it was at the time. But all of those kind of cultural ideas, these ideas of kind of really cultural and national states in the British Isles, they really formulate in sort of the 9th century, and they all formulate pretty rapidly. The English, the Scottish, and even the idea of the Welsh, of the Cymry, all kind of enter the record around the 9th century. You can get into some very heated arguments with English and Scottish academics about who got there first, if you'd like to. Hopefully, as we'll touch on, in actual fact, the Cornish get there first in terms of a national identity. But we'll sort of circle back around to that. The interesting thing about this as well is the other side of this narrative of the sweeping monolithic people coming in is that it views the Romano-Britons as, again, a monolith. This idea that they were Roman and they were Britons, and that was, their identity. But actually, we don't know that. If you look at the evidence, that might be true for some people in the southeast, where Roman identity was much stronger, the infrastructure was much stronger. Again, maybe in the north around York and Hadrian's Wall, where there's a large legionary presence. But actually, you see very quickly return to sort of tribal identities, the Dorotriges, the Daemonia. And you get the impression that actually for them, it was probably layered ideas of identity. They would identify themselves as Roman citizens when Rome was there, but below that, they might say, well, actually, I'm a member of the Dorotriges or the Iceni or one of these other tribal groups. And you get the impression that actually the whole picture is at once less chaotic and more chaotic than we've ever given it credit for. So, oh, and obviously another great example of this is Kent. Kent is called Kent for a huge amount of time, from the sort of pre-Roman period right the way through to the Anglo-Saxon and to today. It sort of, the spelling changes, you get a C and A and E in there occasionally, but the Germanic settlers who arrive there mix with the locals and they sort of start calling themselves the men of Kent quite quickly. So these ideas are not as cut and dry as we're here, we're coming in to do this. Right, so Gildas. I've put the whole quote in there. I won't read the whole thing to you. The thing to say about Gildas is that he's close to contemporary with these events. So for a long time, he was referred to pretty much verbatim as this is the history of these events. There is one particular thing I want to refer to, though, which is this line, which is, for alas, the subject of my complaint is the general destruction of everything that is good and the general growth of evil throughout the land. And if you read that today in almost any context, whatever they were discussing, you would not believe whatever the next thing they said came out of their mouth. Gildas is an incredibly visceral writer. He's extremely angry. He's not actually angry at any invaders, by the way. This is the other great part of it. He's very critical of the kings of the Britons, and basically says that they are godless and they are weak and they have done this, that, and the other. But he's this kind of fiery preacher that we have this sermon, this kind of cutting complaints from, but he is not an accurate historical record. So hopefully that kind of highlights some of the problems of this idea that the Saxons arrive, the Britons are defeated, we all run away, and that that then we move on to the next stage of history. It was a much slower, it's a much more gradual process. So specifically looking at the Southwest, looking at Demonia, what did the end of Roman rule mean for them as a starting point? And the reality is probably not as much as we think. They're in the Southwest. As I said, the best fit you're going to get for that traditional model is probably the Southeast and the East, where Roman infrastructure was strongest. They are trading tin. They have been trading tin for thousands of years. In ancient Egypt, the Phoenicians, you find examples of Cornish tin. They have lost a major market or easy access to a market, which would probably not be great. But they are neighbored by Romano-Britons, who they have known for generations, the Dorotriges in this case, and then other Romano-British tribes we know less about. They are expanding, in actual fact. They go out and they found new colonies. They build great fortresses like Tintagel, and fortifications like the Giant's Hedge in the Lou Peninsula. These are not people who are, again, suffering some kind of apocalypse. These are an active, engaged elite who are out there trying to recover from what is for them a primarily economic issue, that they have lost a big market. They want to secure it. Where you can see this most clearly is if you look at the picture on the left, and the reason these are very bright and colorful, by the way, is these are a man called Dave Smith illustrations in Plymouth, made these for our school resources packs. These are intended for children, but they are still good maps, and I have access to them, so I will use them. And you can see the settlements. And again, that narrative of before of the Saxons arrive, the Britons flee, they establish Brittany in flight, they establish a area in northern Spain. And if you stop and think about that for a second, that's very weird. We have historical examples of people being driven from their homes, but they are driven, they leave. The Huns, the Vandals, they get up and go as a people. You don't stay in one place while also going to another. That's not fleeing, that's establishing colonies, that's expanding, nation building. And it starts to make even more sense when you look at the map on the right. So the map on the right is from a thesis about Bronze Age and the importance of the tin trade. The red sections on that are naturally occurring tin deposits in Europe. So if you look at that, and then you look at the map of where the southwestern Britons, particularly in Brittany, the initial areas settled are Kernow, Demonie, So Damonia, Cornwall, these very strong southwest linked names. They continue to have cultural exchanges throughout the early medieval period. They've gone to secure the tin trade, because for them, the important thing isn't what's happening in the southeast of Britain, which is a long way away through lots of other people. The important thing is what's happening in the Mediterranean, what's happening with the Atlantic trade routes, and how do we reestablish ourselves in a preeminent place to control and benefit from that trade. These are very deliberate moves by an elite who are active and in charge. So you can sort of see that. And the thing that kind of drives this home for me is this is a specific object. There are lots of really cool objects in Cornwall from this period. I do recommend going on the finds.org database. You can see lots of fun stuff. This is a brooch, so something to secure a cloak. It is a gripping sort of beast motif. Specifically, it's very similar to what you see in Anglo-Saxon metalwork, what's called the quoit style. Except on quoit style brooches, it's part of a design. So they're really teeny tiny, and they make big sort of interlocking designs in these big circles. This is much bigger, obviously. This is, in terms of the form, is much more similar to a Frankish sort of brooch, where they have these kind of large animal-shaped brooches. So whoever made this, whoever commissioned it, is aware and linked into this wider European network to have these different metalwork styles in mind, and to be able to make something that integrates features from both. You know, this is not people stuck on the edge of nowhere. These are people at the heart of an early medieval European trade network. And there you can actually see, thanks to a company called Danegeld, who's a jewelry craftsman, what it would have looked like sort of brand new. You know, this is a beautiful piece of metalwork, highly skilled, and just really interesting. So when does this kind of start to change? So eventually the Saxons, or you know, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, as we'll call them for ease, arrive on the borders of this sort of greater Demonian state. It happens around the sort of 6th, 7th century, very sort of late in the 6th century. A Saxon king called Hehil, he defeats a conglomeration of British kings somewhere around Bath, takes over Bath and a few other cities in that region. He then moves forward, and it said he fought the Britons at a place called Fethnelag. And then it says Cutha, who's his brother, was slain, and then Colin basically burnt loads of things, and wrathfully he returned to his own. So if you've just won a battle, why are you wrathfully returning to your own? Why are you, you know, not moving forward? Because previously he had been on essentially on a campaign of expansion. He also loses the kingship in a couple of years as well. So we get the first hint, and this is all from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, obviously, that actually he may have met somebody when he got to this point that he didn't just defeat, that actually it wasn't a great thing, particularly as Cutha was probably his heir at the time. So he lost his atheling, as they would say. You then sort of get to this point where there are continuing clashes into sort of the 7th century. Eventually, they do sort of push through. They drive down until the border is around the Parrett in Somerset. And then this is interesting because you start now to get to the point where lots of traditional historians will say, oh, well, yes, they may have fought for a bit, and then they lost. Wessex moved through to Devon, and then you know, Cornwall follows soon after. They do that because there's sort of entries like in 682, Kentwine, King of Wessex, drove the Britons as far as the sea, and that sounds, you know, wonderfully evocative. This idea of, you know, he drove them out, and you know, you will find people arguing that what this means is he drove them from, you know, Devon, Somerset to Land's End, all the way, and you know, that would be a remarkable achievement for an army without the widespread use of cavalry moving hundreds of miles, you know, all the rest of it. If you look at it back towards the Parrett, where actually we're told the border is, and they got stuck on between the Parrett and the Quantocks, you're talking about 5 miles, potentially having driven a trapped army. So you kind of have to start taking the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle with a little bit of a pinch of salt, because they are very likely to kind of make these grandiose statements, these huge sort of claims. If they ever lose, they kind of either mention it very passingly, or just don't say who won, or they just don't mention it at all. But you start to get the impression that things that have been taken on face value for a very long time probably deserved a little bit more interrogation. So the border of the Parrot is eventually sort of set. You then, in the start of the 8th century, you get the real feeling that the relations between Damonia and Wessex are very strained. Aldhelm, who will eventually become Saint Aldhelm, writes a very acrimonious and very long-winded, even by the standards of the age, letter to King Geraint of Damonia, basically remonstrating him because the church in Damonia follows what they would have called the Irish, and what now is referred to usually as the Celtic practices of Easter and cutting your hair. So these seem very strange things to have arguments about. For early medieval Catholic Church, this was life and death stuff. But it's essentially about how monks shave your head. You either have the sort of friar tuck, as we would normally think of a monk. The Celtic or Irish way is different. We're not 100% sure how they did it. The leading theory I've always heard is kind of a straight line like that over the crown of the head, but we don't really know. And the calculation of Easter is done differently. What this tells us is two things that are really important. One is that despite the occasional claims to the contrary, there is still a strong central power in Damonia. Aldhelm is writing to him. He says all this stuff of the sceptred hand of the Western Kingdom, all this kind of very superlative stuff. He is clearly an important man who Aldhelm thinks can convince the church, which is obviously an important institution, to change its practices. It also tells us that there are still these kind of cultural differences. So regardless of whether or not we believe in the full-blooded invasion or everything else, there are very clear-cut cultural differences between Wessex and Damonia. And religion is one aspect of that. So in 710, this all comes to a head. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that King Ina and his son defeat a British prince, Geraint, and basically drive him before them. We also, interestingly, from the Welsh side, in I believe it's the Black Book of Carmarthen, have a poem called Geraint ab Urbin, which is an elegy essentially for a warrior falling in battle. It's a very early mention of Arthur, so a lot of people get very excited about it as a kenning for kind of bravery and war leading. It's very sort of incredibly evocative language about horses charging and this kind of melee and all the rest of it. It talks about Longborth as the place where Geraint falls, which we debate about a lot of where it is. For my money, it's probably Langport in Somerset. You don't get very often historical names that carry down that clearly. It's right on the border area, right on the Parrot essentially, and it's very near to where Taunton will be built very soon after this. Taunton seems to enter the historical record at around the sort of 8th century. It then gets pulled down very rapidly because a fleeing prince goes through it and the king has to go through. And the impression is very strong that it's actually kind of just literally something they've thrown up, they have to pull down again. So what that does do, the victory over Geraint, is Wessex is now through the Parrot and into Devon. This is the culmination of, as we sort of touched on, a series of engagements, which, while they haven't always gone Wessex's way, they have been a kind of march that's gobbled up terrain bit by bit. So in 722, in the Welsh Annals, we actually have an entry which does not appear in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is not surprising, given, again, what we've already touched on with where they record their victories or their losses. And it sort of says, at the Battle of Hehil among the Cornish, the Battle of Gortmelog, the Battle of Pencon, the Saprins, and the Britons were victors in these battles. So the interesting things here, it's that Latin, apud Cornienses, is a direct mention of the Cornish as an identity. It's talking about, obviously, a victory, which is great. You do find people argue that, oh, actually, they were fighting someone else. But the fact they don't mention who they're fighting does lean very heavily to they were fighting the people they had been fighting for hundreds of years at this point, or 100 years at this point. It also then precedes a couple of entries in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, where instead of these kind of marching victories or anything else, it's talking about hard battles against the Welsh, these sort of difficult struggles. That, I think at one point the king is warring constantly and he's assailed on all the sides, sort of thing. So what we've got is a steady march, this sort of steady incremental much slower than usually acknowledged, but still a steady advance, is halted, and then it devolves into this kind of constant conflict. It also kind of, as I said, it's the first mention of the Cornish, that then gets repeated in sort of later poetry, where you have them entered into like the Ames Prydain, which is the dream of Britain, which is this great Welsh poem about how the Cymry will unite, again, the formation of this kind of identity of the Cymry, the folk, as a block opposing the English or the Scottish, with the Cornish, the men of Man, the Vikings, because the Welsh and the Cornish to a certain extent were quite fond of the Vikings. The Vikings were fighting the Saxons, you know, why wouldn't you be? And they will drive the Saxons into the sea and reclaim all the sort of land. In this context, then, when we're talking about these sort of battles, it also starts to make other Anglo-Saxon entries make slightly more sense. We've got King Egbert. Egbert is a very good warrior. He is, by the standards of the kings of Wessex, he is severely underrated. I'm never clear why. I suspect possibly because his name sounds silly to modern ears. But he is extremely successful in battle, not just against the Cornish, but against Mercia and other Saxon kingdoms. He famously, again, in sort of 815, he's harried the Cornish from east to west, which, if you follow that traditional narrative, which we touched on again, that kind of sweeping victory, people again have sort of said, oh, he went from the Tamar to Land's End and he burnt everything down, and that was the end of Cornish independence. And all that stuff. And again, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't track with what we later know. If the Saxons are able to exert that kind of influence, why are they then still fighting the Cornish? Why aren't they just ruling the Cornish as a people like they've done every other thing? If we instead look at the victory at Hehil as the start of a more fiercely fought period of conflict, it makes more sense that possibly what he's doing is driving significant British resistance past the Tamar. So he's kind of staking a more solid claim on Western Devon. And then in that context, we can then put the other battles which we know about much more on a firmer footing, and they don't just appear out of nowhere, which they would do if you followed that kind of, oh, they were defeated at Fethnalag, or they were defeated here at Egbert by Egbert. In 825, we see a Cornish and the men of Devon, or the Defonas, this is again the first time Devon really gets mentioned, at a fight at Gaffelford, which is probably Galford near Lew Trenchard. And again, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle doesn't mention a winner. So they just sort of say there was a fight between these two. And for a long time, this has kind of been assumed to be a Wessex victory. But interestingly, a couple of charters are issued by King Egbert in this year, which are issued in Crediton, which is obviously quite far west. He's at war at the time with the King of Mercia, which is obviously the Midlands, so it's quite far north from Crediton. But it says specifically he is amongst the army. So he has gathered forces, royal forces, to respond to something quite far away from where you would think he would be. So theoretically, it's possible that this battle actually went against them, and Egbert had to respond with a royal force, which would be better trained and better maintained. And then in 836, the Cornish ally with incoming Vikings, probably from Ireland, sort of Hiberno Norse type, attempt to again push into Devon, and again are defeated by Egbert. I really have to stress he is very good at killing people. And that sort of ends the direct period of opposition, and that people then could get into the question of, well, does that mean Wessex won? And it's quite a loaded question in a lot of ways. They probably exert some level of influence over a separate Cornish state. There is still a king of Cornwall. We have evidence through into 875. Intriguingly, when you look at King Alfred the Great and his burghs, his great defensive works, he doesn't build any in Cornwall. He actually builds them along the line of the border, more or less. So he clearly doesn't think it's part of his kingdom that he can defend. At the same time, we don't have a huge amount of records of big Viking raids in Cornwall. So despite the fact that they're not part of Wessex and this resistance to the Vikings, they're also not suffering particularly. So there are questions that can arise there about how much control the King of Wessex actually had over the Cornish. And that is directly as a result of this kind of end of conflict that sort of ends as we've fought each other for a long time. Maybe it's time to sort of put an end to it, rather than we are the victorious army having conquered your your territory on either side. So all of that can then be traced right back to that first victory that against King Ina, who's the first of these kind of invading kings at Hehil, which starts off around a century of fighting, which ends with this status quo, which ends really with a separate Cornish identity preserved, whereas ideas like the Dorotriges that we mentioned before and other more Eastern Romano-British tribes are not preserved in the same way. We know very little about them. And the Dorotriges were at one point issuing their own currency. They were a serious kingdom or a group that just have vanished over time. So the importance of this battle, at least in my mind, is really high up there in the history of the early medieval period, and particularly for obviously Cornish culture and history. So hopefully next year in July, we will be hosting a large reenactment of the battle to celebrate. More than that, the idea is that we will have a reenactment of the battle to draw people in, because people like seeing fighting, in my experience. I've done reenactment for about 16 years. But alongside that, we will hopefully have other organizations like hurling, Cornish wrestling, Cornish language groups, song groups, and all the rest of it, to celebrate everything that's unique and great in Cornish culture. And provide a space to really engage people who might not otherwise be engaged in this part of their history and this part of their past directly in it in a very real way. If you've chosen to give through the Eventbrite page, that's great. We will put that money to good use, hopefully with the venue and everything else. If not, feel free to check out Hehil 1300 on Facebook. But yeah, I'll wrap up my talk. Fairly rapid tour through early medieval Cornwall and the start of the thing. Hopefully it was interesting. And I'll open it up to questions.
Great. Thank you very much, John. That was a fantastic overview. I especially enjoyed all this setting the viewpoint of the early post-Roman era in Britain and how that's maybe quite different from what we usually imagine. Yeah, really enjoyed all this. Clearly, there's so many details going into it as well. If anyone does have any questions for John, please put them into the chat. If you want to come up for more of a discussion, we can happily provide a platform for that too, just indicate that. Otherwise, I will get us started with some questions that I have myself. I think, as I said, I've got plenty of ones, I guess, about the more early end of Roman rule time, but I want to start with a bit more obvious one. First, with the Battle of Hehil itself, do we know where that was geographically?
Unfortunately, we don't. With a lot of these battles, so for example, I mentioned Fethenlag, there's also the Battle of Bindon, which is quite important in the period. These are names which are either Brythonic or Saxon that then fall out of use at some point. As I sort of mentioned or hinted at with the Battle of Longboard, the fact that there is a place called Langport, almost exactly where you would expect the battle to be, is incredibly convenient by early medieval standards. The likelihood is it was somewhere in West Devon. That people have also said maybe sort of Eastern Cornwall if they had gotten that far. I think when you look at the pattern of conflict and movement after, and also the place name evidence, because West and South West Devon maintains a large number of Brythonic place names even today, it was probably somewhere in West and Mid Devon.
Great, thanks. So I'm guessing that just goes to show a bit how this really started the century of conflict, as you called it. Basically, if the battle location wasn't quite yet near the Tamar or over the Tamar, that this would be the start of the press of the Wessex forces. Yeah, so it's in terms of Wessex versus Daemonia, the conflict kind of begins further east, so in sort of past the Perrot in Somerset, probably. There are differing opinions about how far Daemonia went and where the Dorotriges start. It's not always clear because, again, a lot of this history has kind of been lost or erased by the changing control. And again, it's also this factor that nationality is not always as clear cut or as clear as we would like it to be historically. But yeah, it kind of rose through from Somerset and then into past 710. You're talking about probably Eastern Devon certainly coming into more and more Wessex control.
Just the fact that even today, you have to drive through Taunton, it was obviously a Saxon name, to get to the southwest, because it would have been even more important in the day when the Somerset levels weren't drained. Just for example, for those of us who, and I believe it's probably most people who lived down here in the floods in 2015, imagine doing that without the benefit of the M5, and also with a determined and armed opposition trying to stop you. So it's that sort of natural choke point. Once that's exploited, there's very little natural defensively to stop you getting into Eastern Devon. Whereas once you're in Eastern Devon, there's obviously Dartmoor, which is there and brooding, and even in the sort of 17th century is this big obstacle to travel. And there's more of a chance for a natural barrier to support the defenders in that.
Awesome, thank you. I'll start us off then with audience questions. Robin asks one that I had actually jotted down myself as well. Earlier in your talk, you mentioned a database that you can look at ancient or historical objects in Cornwall. Could you just elaborate, mention again what that was called and elaborate on that maybe, please?
Yeah, so I'll whack up a link as well, but it's the Portable Antiquities Scheme, and they maintain a database which is searchable. It's a little bit finicky to search, but you do get used to it relatively quickly. I do recommend the advanced search as well, because that gives you not only much more options to narrow down your search, but also sometimes that's a little bit more intuitive because it has very strange ideas sometimes of what it thinks you're looking for. So I'll just whack that up. But yeah, you can narrow it down by region, by time period. So for example, this stuff between the fall of Rome and 1066 would be early medieval. I believe after that becomes medieval, or and moving right through to industrial and all that. So yeah, so finds.org, which is portable. There you go.
That's really cool, thank you. I'm guessing that's some sort of like publicly deposited objects that are also available in museums then somewhere.
So they're not always in museums. This is why it's quite important. It's a good resource to have. They usually are. However, in general, it's things that have been reported to the Portable Antiquity Scheme. So some of them may enter private collections, but the find spot will be recorded, and where possible, there'll be an image of it. I don't know a huge amount about the treasure policy, but I think essentially things that we have lots of, I think metal detectors get to keep, but they still like to know where it was found and what it was. So, for example, like certain coins of Wessex, we have quite a lot of, and if it's a single coin, it's probably not vital to a local museum. But
yeah, fair enough. Cheers. I'll carry on with the audience question then. We've got one here from Tyler about the battles themselves. Do we have any clues as to the size of these conflicts and the forces that might have been involved? You did mention something with cavalry probably not being present in the beginning, I'm guessing.
Yeah, well, so yeah, this I'll start with Tyler's question. So we do and we don't. As you get later into the period, we do know the battles get larger. There is, interestingly, the Battle of, I think it's Beamden, but I will just check my notes quickly, where they, hang on, I'm just pulling it up now, sorry, apologies for this. Yeah, here we go. So yeah, at Bindon, Cinegils, who's Cinewulf's heir, is said to have killed 2,046 Welsh, or Walas, as I thought that actually would be, which is incredibly specific, just in general. However, it's also near enough, not exactly, but in the same region as the best estimates that people have put forward for Norman casualties at the Battle of Hastings. Now, if you compare the Battle of Hastings is one of the biggest battles of the early medieval period, and the Norman army is a conglomeration of the Normans, the Bretons, the Flemish to a certain extent. And then consider that after Beamden, there aren't a huge amount of evidence for a sudden Wessex expansion. It's just probably nonsense. He maybe killed a larger warband, but we don't really know. So estimates get very rough. Probably they're smaller than we imagine they are. You're probably talking about a few hundred people for even a conflict between a kingdom like Livonia and a kingdom like Wessex. In terms of, one thing we do know more is that the majority of the fighting is done by professionals, by the retainers of various lords. So these would eventually be Huscarls for the Saxons, or hearth troops earlier in the period, and what in Cornish would be taili, which is family. So these are the retainers of the lords. Where I said about cavalry, so cavalry is used by everyone to a certain extent. So the Saxons know how to ride horses, they ride horses to battle, and we know from poetry that they ride up to a battle. However, they're not specialized in the way that the later Norman knights are, and they don't seem to use it as frequently as the Cornish probably do, or the Demonians do. So I mentioned Geraint ab Urban. The majority of the kennings in Geraint ab Urban deal with horses. They say, I saw horses white with foam, and above the din of battle, the sounds of swinging swords and stuff. And it's all about horses and horses charging and horses being bloody and all the rest of it. We also can see this with the Bretons, who obviously, as I say, had a very close cultural link to Southwest Britain. They, when they're fighting the Franks, they make a significant use of light cavalry to harass the Franks and heavy infantry, to the point where the Franks essentially have to give up and go home, which is where the Breton kingdom actually is first established. So I've gone a bit off topic, but just because the issue of cavalry is an interesting one. It's probably one of the areas where culturally there is more of a divide, not in the use of cavalry, as I say, everyone did use cavalry, but where the importance of cavalry was to the warrior culture. It was probably much more central, and we see this in Wales as well, to a Brittonic warrior culture, whereas it is something you do, but might not be your focus in the Saxon army.
Great, thanks. Am I right in assuming then that these sort of battles, say Hehil itself, would have been smaller in scale than the sort of Roman conflicts coming before, or the other conflicts during the actual later medieval periods?
Yeah, I think, yeah, there's, particularly when you look at the Romans, I think the big engagements they have, particularly against other empires, are, these huge conflicts. Nothing close to that happens in the early medieval period, probably including 1066. It's one of those things where maybe it's a bit getting closer to that scale. Not least because the logistics you need to support an army of that size are quite complicated. As I said, what we do find isn't chaos necessarily, or the abandonment of everything that we hold dear when the Romans leave, but we are talking about smaller units, smaller polities, smaller groups. So there is a limit to the number of people, of non-productive people ultimately, because to be a fighter, somebody who is primarily good at killing people, you are not farming, you are not making stuff, you are not doing anything actually useful for society. You are collecting taxes probably for your lord for the most part, guarding trade routes, doing that sort of stuff, which has an economic value to a certain extent, but is not really productive in that sense. So yeah, when you're talking about these smaller polities, you are shrinking the size of engagements realistically.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. Before I monopolize you too much, I'll carry on with the audience questions again and address the other one from Robin here, who asks, what more is known of King Geraint, or Geraint? I'm not trying the pronunciation myself.
More than we know of a lot of people, but unfortunately I have covered pretty much it. We know that he's the king that Aldhelm is writing to. Aldhelm addresses him as king of the Western Kingdom, and it is very flowing. He's obviously in charge of what we would call Demonia. And we then have the elegy, which even that is controversial insofar as it might refer to a different person. I think, and other people agree with me, it's not just me on my own, that it probably is him that we're dealing with, and may also refer to the other guy because poets will reuse things if they want to. So the other battle is 500 something, 510, I think, that they put forward as a candidate for it. So given this is an oral tradition, it's entirely possible that actually a bard kind of happened to roll and went, oh, that rhymes with that, perfect, and did it, and that happens to be the version that we have written down. Yeah, other than that, we know very little. There are genealogies of Cornish royalty, which will so they'll say Urban, because Ab Urban is obviously son of Urban, and then they will sometimes mention children of his. They are of varying levels of sort of accuracy, I would say. Sometimes they're produced usually in terms of land claims and things like that. So there's not a lot you can put about them. Yeah, we know he was a king. We know he was probably fighting with a mounted taili, as I said. But other than that, we don't know a huge amount.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess it just goes to show again that the sort of quality of the sources of that period.
Yeah.
The next comment here is from Michelle, saying if Hehil 1300 goes well, why not consider a Battle of Bowley anniversary? She's got a good lecture on that, which would complement this great talk too. So a compliment there for you too. I'm just wondering if you might have any more info on the Battle of Bowley for us. Otherwise, maybe Michelle could elaborate on that too.
I'll put my hands up. I don't, so I'm more than happy to learn more. Though I'm more than happy to hit people as many times as possible as I'm allowed to. So.
Battle of Bowley, said to be the Cornish last stand. Various dates, 927 seems to be the most plausible. Athelstan on his way down to claim the Isles of Scilly fought a battle which is sometimes thought to be along the Lamorna River. There are residents of Lamorna who will tell you exactly which field it took place in, but none of them can quite agree. But it's an interesting one, and it seems to be part of Athelstan's drive to get down to the end again, partly because of Cornish Viking collaborations, and obviously he couldn't afford to have the Vikings coming through the cat flap of White Sand Bay while he was fighting them up country. So yeah, but it seems to sort of presage a let's win hearts and minds policy. Again, it goes on, and the Exeter incident that Melanie has noted in her comments when the Cornish were expelled from Exeter is part and parcel of that, and he goes on to set the border at the Tamar. So again, although Dungarth, the last Cornish king, said to have died in a boating incident in 875, the Anglo-Saxons don't seem to have annexed it per se. No doubt they had their own local sort of nobles that they cultivated, etc. And then Athelstan goes on to celebrate Bodmin and St. Buryan and elevate them in status as two ecclesiastical centres that promote his interests. But it doesn't seem to have been a political annexation, but there does seem to have been a military action. And the Lamorna stream, running as it does through that heartland of what you could consider the Wiltshire plain of Cornwall, along with Bodmin Moor, you know, very rich in a whole range of prehistoric, very key monuments, seems to have been a focal point for the idea of trying to stop him getting right the way through to the end. So yeah, might have some mileage, I don't know, but it'd be lovely to see you down here in West Cornwall doing a reenactment, John.
Yeah, no, so thank you for that. Yeah, it's something I didn't realize it was called that. I've only looked into a little bit, so because Athelstan and Cornwall is obviously a really interesting area. The Exeter incident, as people said, comes to us from Geoffrey of Monmouth, who's writing a couple hundred years later. Geoffrey has a very vested interest in making Athelstan look good because Athelstan founded his monastery. He's also very, I think, reflecting the attitudes of the time, insofar as you've said, Cornwall remains Cornish. It's even after Athelstan sets the border of the Tamar, which I'll swing back around to in a minute. It is very separate. It's culturally separate. The language is still spoken and everything else. I think, and you see this a lot in the saint stories as well, which also appear in sort of the 13th and 12th centuries. The Cornish almost get treated as this kind of weird other, where there's kind of like, they're familiar enough for people to understand, but also they're exotic enough that we can say lots of different things. So, for example, you have the saint stories where, you know, the saint is being chased by some chieftain's daughter. I think that's Saint Neot, over the hills and the dells and all the rest of it. Where obviously that wouldn't, a chieftain in that period would be very bizarre to sort of see and stuff like that. So that you get all these kind of tales spun around it. It's interesting with him, particularly that, you know, he's this filthy race, and that's very, you know, that's very strong for people who are at least allied with, you know, your thing. So I think there's a little bit of bias you can see creeping in there as well. With the Tamar and the border, I think that's much more clear cut. Athelstan does seem to set that as the border, and as we kind of touched on, he's acknowledging really the reality. You know, when we go through that sort of list of battles and back and forth, it solidifies around the Tamar. You know, that area of the southwest. I mean, you can obviously see the Tamar itself. Obviously, very big, wide river. You do have very difficult ground on the other side of it. You know, I always think if you drive from Plymouth over the bridge, into Saltash. You know, once you're on the road again, there's those very steep hills and woods and forests on either side. I would not like to be marching an army along those roads with someone unfriendly on the other side. He's also, as a king, and I think you touched on this with the kind of hearts and minds sort of thing, he's much more willing to work with other kings than many of his predecessors are. He obviously calls all the kings of Britain together to get them all to swear fealty to him at one point. He then is fighting a bunch of them a couple of years later because that's the way early medieval politics works. But he becomes the king of all Britain, as he's acknowledged by the various kings of Britain, by accepting other kings as existing more than trying to conquer everybody. So I think there's a lot of interesting stuff there. With the military campaign, I know less about that than I do about the Exeter stuff. I think probably with the Exeter stuff, what happened was he maybe was pushing any British landholders still on the other side of the Tamar into Cornwall properly and saying, go over there. Because again, like you said, the Bodmin Monastery starts being involved in all sorts of land deals on both sides of the Tamar and transferring land about. So it's possible that he sort of said he's trying to remove people onto the other side of the Tamar. I don't think Exeter probably was directly involved in it. When you sort of go back to Geoffrey, he says he went to Exeter and he talked to people about it. But you can talk to people about things and they'll say, oh yes, that definitely this is what happened right here. And so I'm not sure how much sort of physical removal there was from Exeter, given it's probably been in Saxon hands for a longer time.
Great, thank you. Addressed a lot that was actually brought up in the chat there too. And you provided a perfect introduction to another one of Robin's questions, asking more about landscape. That is, as you already touched on, crucial in battle and choice of location. So do we know anything about the state of deforestation at the time and how the landscape may have been different? Were paths even suitable for an army at speed, or rivers for both attack and defense?
So yeah, other people know more than I do about landscape, to be fair. It was much more heavily forested than it is today. Just using a local example, where I live in Plymouth, which is obviously the other side of the Tamar, but only just, in the Domesday Book, which we have very good records for the West Country because the Exeter book is one of the only ones that survived of the sub-books. The area around me in Eggbuckland is acres and acres of woodland. It's recorded, it's producing wood and chalk and all the rest of it. So yeah, it was definitely much more heavily forested. Ideally, you moved by Roman roads. If you look at law codes from the time, it was usually part of holding land that included part of a Roman road that you had to maintain it. Obviously, the Roman roads down here stop in Exeter, and this again is probably one of the reasons why things become much more punchy once you're in East Devon, but you can't push across to West Devon. I sort of touched on Dartmoor. There was a quote I used in my dissertation actually, which was from the 17th century, which basically said, if you want to get to Cornwall and West Devon, you can either go around Dartmoor or you can get lost and die. And that was kind of it is this huge, daunting thing to try and get across if you're not a local. And there's not the sort of national park infrastructure in place to tell you where you're going. So yeah, landscape is absolutely crucial. Rivers, yeah, again, the Vikings are very interested in this area because there are the rivers, they pull into the River Tamar in 836. I think they do it again in the 10th century and they burn Tavistock to the ground. Obviously, their ability to move along rivers is one of their key advantages, which is weird to think about because obviously the Saxons also arrived by boat. The Cornish, we know, and the Bretons did use boats, used them quite extensively. There's huge trade networks in Ireland and Cornwall and Brittany and all the rest of it. But yeah, so rivers, if you can travel by boat, that's great. If you're traveling overland, you want to be on a Roman road. If you're not on a Roman road, yeah, things probably start to get a little bit more worrying for you. Battle in terms of where you would fight somebody, ideally you would fight somebody on, if they were attacking you, you would have the high ground. Everyone fought in very similar ways, other than I'd say bits of thing about the importance of cavalry and stuff. You would form up your men probably in a shield wall on top of the most defensible place you could find. You would throw missiles at each other, so spears, javelins, bows and arrows. Usually, we think, in actual fact, one side probably legged it at that point. Because if you're gonna fight this way, and this is kind of getting off topic, but hopefully people will find it interesting. It's a very nasty way of fighting. It is, you are inches away from another human being, shield to shield, spears flying in. A lot of the injuries we have are facial injuries, so you're just taking weapons to the face. This is why the people who fought were trained professionals, because if you were just an amateur or somebody who got pulled up, probably you would have liked it. You didn't want to be there. It's why the battles we know about, the big battles, things that get mentioned, are notable, because actually if you take all the mentions of battles for this period, there's not that many for what we think was quite a violent time. And that's probably because the times when the two sides actually closed and engaged were the exception rather than the rule. So these are where, for example, with Hehil, a stand has to be made to prevent the continuing loss. Even at Longbourth, probably that was an all-out attempt to stop the gap at Taunton from being taken, to preserve the other natural barriers, the Somerset levels, the Clontarfs, which made your life easier as a defender.
Thank you. I really loved the quote you threw at us earlier, and Tyler puts a nice comment in the chat box here as well about learning at school that the Romans didn't fancy Cornwall much due to the marshes and forests between Somerset, Devon, and the Cornish border. That just fits perfectly in with the Dartmoor picture, doesn't it?
It does, but and I'm sorry, Tyler, because I know Tyler. He's joining my reenactment group. It's a misconception. There's not very much Roman infrastructure down here. That's true, but that's more to do with the fact, as I mentioned previously, the Cornish were quite happy to sell tin to people. The Romans wanted the tin. It was one of their primary reasons for invading the British Isles. So what seems to happen very quickly is that the Duro-Triges put up a lot of fight. That's Maiden Castle and these big Roman battles. And they get slaughtered, and it's brutal, and it's Roman military efficiency 101. Probably what happened, they came in and they made the same offer they made to every chieftain in Britain, really, which is live under Roman rule and pay your taxes, or resist and die, essentially. And they sort of said, "Yeah, sure, we'll sell you the tin, continue, be left alone, and we'll all move on." Because it didn't, again, it's this thing that they care about, probably, given the importance of tin as an export to their economy, they care about keeping that flowing and how that impacts on their sort of economy. They don't necessarily have these very strongly held feelings about being ruled by an imperial power, particularly when Rome, as an imperial power, once it's established, cares much more about protecting soft power to make you Roman, rather than stamping the imperial boot down on you. Even the really famous revolt we have in Britain, Boudicca's revolt, is only after she and her husband have been under kings under Roman rule for a significant period. And it's the idiocy of the Roman governor basically attempting to steal her land after this has worked out fine for everyone that caused the whole revolt that nearly disrupted Roman Britain in the first place.
Awesome, cheers. We do have a whole discussion going on in the chat at the moment about the relationship of Athelstan and Cornish kings. But before we get to that, while we're still kind of on the topic of landscape, a quite obvious one, obviously, if you want to go around Dartmoor as well, and very relevant to Cornwall, is the sea. And we had a comment by Loveday in the chat too, saying that Cornish, Vikings, and Romans all moved around by boat. Is this in stark contrast to the Wessex kingdom at the time, or did that even play a role in these sort of skirmishes?
It's really interesting about the Saxons in general and Wessex as well, that they don't seem to make a huge use of naval power. They do trade with people. People from Wessex go to Rome, they go all over the place. There are trade networks established. But what we probably are starting to see is the shift from trade being focused in the Mediterranean and what's going on down there, to a kind of more Northern European model that we would recognize today. So you're talking about Northern France, Germany, the place Saxons came from. But yeah, no, because it's King Alfred founds the British Navy. He's recognized as the founder of the British Navy. And that's fairly late in Wessex's history. That's the sort of 9th century. Whereas, yeah, as I sort of mentioned, for the Cornish, for the Bretons, the ability to trade over the sea was hugely important. They do significant amounts of trading with the Vikings. why the Vikings are happy to trade and settle an ally in Cornwall rather than burn and pillage, because we have very few recorded attacks until the late 10th century in Cornwall, might be because the Cornish are pretty good at dealing with maritime incursions. They've been fighting the Irish for a significant amount of time from the collapse of Roman period. If you look at Tinstrel and the Giant's Hedge, they create a north-south defensive points, at which point the Vikings, who are also extremely pragmatic people, despite having this reputation for them, might have thought it was easier to take a cut of the tin trade by trading it to Ireland and all the rest of it, and also the slave trade, because as the Bodmin many missions, which got mentioned earlier, show, the Cornish are a slave-holding people, as are everybody else at this time. It's probably they're happy to trade. The maritime routes on the Irish Sea and the Eastern Atlantic trade routes are hugely important to all of these groups. Whereas, yeah, the Saxon sea power is this very kind of strange thing where you'd think they arrived by boats, they would have maintained that tradition. It doesn't seem to be as important until Alfred is building a fleet to oppose the Vikings, essentially.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so as I said, there's been a quite long discussion actually in the chat about Athelstan and the relationship to Cornish kings, and I have to admit I have been struggling quite a bit to follow this while trying to pay attention to this as well. But the kind of gist I get from this is Loveday basically mentioned a book called The Promontory People by Craig Weatherhill, highlighting cultural differences in Cornwall because of many family kings at that period. And then sort of the conclusion seems to be that Athelstan exerted more of his power through the church and then settled to coexist with the Cornish king. Or am I misrepresenting that? I see heads shaking in the chat. Anyway, is there anything else you want to add on this topic, given the opportunity here, or is there something you also want to?
No, I think in fairness, I think it's an argument, because we don't have these really great records of who's the king in Cornwall, but we do have enough to say there probably is a Cornish ruling class. As I've said, Athelstan's MO, where possible, was similar to the Roman approach: leave whoever's in charge as long as they are working the way he wants them to work. He does this with Hehil of Wales, who's quite a powerful Welsh king. He tries to do this with Constantine in Scotland. That doesn't work out so well because Constantine doesn't want to play ball, so they end up having this massive scrap at Brunanburgh. But he's very open to ruling through proxy rather than conquering, occupying, and doing it. Yeah, the mechanisms by which he did that, as I say, Bodmin Abbey does gets a lot of charters very quickly around that sort of time period with the Exeter and the rest of it. There's a lot of land sweeping around the place, being swapped and cut up and the rest of it. So there's an argument around whether it's being done politically or being done through the church. But I think the general point that probably it was a soft power kind of, you say, I'm the over king, you're the sub king, live and let live. I think that's probably a fair thing to say.
Alfred had already started that, hadn't he, John? Because he used to come down and cultivate key nobles and hunt on their estates, etc. But he never came further than the Lidford line. But he was creating those sort of affiliations in the same way as Caesar did before the actual conquest. So creating that clientage, and Athelstan in his policies here and in Wales seems to have done pretty much the same thing. He doesn't then use the church as an evil agent of Anglo-Saxon influence. What he does is actually choose to patronise and bestow gifts on a couple of key churches. So, and when you look at the manumissions in the Bodmin Gospels, you find that you've got key figures who've got both English and Cornish names. You've got Cornish freeing English slaves, people with English names, and you've got people with English names freeing people with Cornish names. So it kind of mixes it up a bit. But it's not a sort of a total policy. It's not really until the Normans you can talk about any sort of formal annexation of Cornwall to England.
But of course, with the Normans, the really interesting thing is that a lot of the landholders down here are Bretons. Hehil of Totnes is a Breton noble. And it seems,
Norman,
yeah, it seems to sort of be that the Cornish are, if not happy, not as unhappy as the rest of Britain when the Norman conquest happened. There are two opportunities.
They did what they did under the Romans. They just carried on working the land and seeing the tin and making money and being left to get on with it while other people took their rake off.
Exactly.
Plus ça change.
because you have two opportunities where they could have got involved. There's the rebellion in Exeter, where Harold Godwin's mother tries to raise the Devon Feards to oppose William. No mention of anybody from Cornwall getting involved, even though they could have, because they were sent home before the Battle of Hastings. And then slightly later on, his sons land in Appledore with an army of Vikings and receive basically no support. So it does seem that if there was no real hankering to return to the old regime once the Normans came.
Thanks. Yeah, that sounds like a very familiar situation for the Cornish or Dominions than even with the Roman period before. Yeah, parallels there too. We have another comment put in the chat earlier from Michelle as well concerning the trade, basically highlighting how there's a huge collection, or there's plenty of items suggesting a very international trade through to the 9th century, really. That was something from the earlier parts of your talk that really fascinated me, how it seems the southwest of Britain was this international trade power. Was this really all driven by the tin, or did it just start with that and then become more important in general for the area?
The importance of tin is really difficult to understate. There's several aspects of this. One, as we've sort of mentioned in that map, is the availability of tin. There's not that many places to find tin in Europe, particularly in sufficient quantities. Then there's how do you extract tin? Mining in this period is not mining as we would understand it a lot of the time. It's not going down the pit with a pickaxe or anything else. We do what's called tin streaming. So you divert a water course, you wash away the topsoil, and the heavier tin deposits remain behind. And this leaves really interesting physical evidence. There was, and I'll have to look it up because I don't have it to hand. There was a excavation recently in Cornwall in a village, which is on the beach, where they found quite a lot of loose debris from around the early medieval period, where they think, and they've now gone through it, and they think this is evidence of actually one of the tin streams where they've just washed off all the stuff. Now, the interesting thing then is, how do you know where to find the tin? Because you're not just finding some appropriate colored box and hitting with the hammer. You have to know where the tin's going. And there is a huge amount of local knowledge that's needed. You need to know what kind of plants will grow in essentially a heavy metal soil, how you look for other plants that are not doing so well. And all of this sort of stuff feeds in. So it's always been a specialist trade. It's almost even more a specialist trade at this period. And you can see this even into the later medieval period, because obviously the stannaries and stannery parliaments are established because tin is that important, that the king of what at that point is a united kingdom in terms of making proclamations and stuff, is willing to give up sections of his powers to maintain the availability of tin. And obviously it's strange because we think of tin now, I mean, Cornish people less so because of the importance of the history, but you say, oh, a tin whistle, a tin this, it's a cheap, nasty metal. It's crucial to make bronze and pewter, which are very important trade goods. It was getting a massive boost in the early medieval period because all these newfangled Christian churches springing up around Europe needed church bells, which were made out of bronze. So you have effectively one of the largest buyers of goods, the church, suddenly buying a large amount of this stuff. So yeah, it is hugely important to the Cornish economy just straight throughout the period and into medieval.
Amazing, cheers. Just wanted to highlight a comment by Robin as well, saying it seems to him that you're making a pretty good case here for Hehil being a crucial battle that keeps Cornish identity distinct. That's definitely the gist I got from this as well. I want to go back to, again, if I may, to something you said earlier when you mentioned that you produced the maps as part of school materials. Is this something for your push for this festival as well, that you're trying to gear it towards kids too?
Yeah, so as I sort of mentioned at the start, there's a traditional narrative, and the Anglo-Saxon Britain, or the post-Roman period, is one of the modules in primary school education. So what we did is we had a very generous grant from the Cornwall Heritage Trust, which paid for the illustrations and a little bit of design work by Dave. So we produced slide packs, which basically go from the period immediately after the Romans into the conflict between Wessex and Demonia, and into the Battle of Hehil, and a little bit of the future beyond that, and then a case study, because there's elements of local case studies for Tintagel itself. And yeah, we've produced that. I'm a quarter of the way through sending it to every primary school in Cornwall. It's a very big list. we've had some good feedback on that, which was really good. Unfortunately, just I did a lot of this during lockdown, obviously, because like most people, I imagine, I had a lot of time on my hands. Unfortunately, it's a module that tends to appear at the start of the academic year, so a lot of them have said this looks great, we can't use it yet, which is just one of those annoying things with timings and how things work out. But we have had some very positive feedback on it as well.
Great, yeah, that sounds like a lot bigger project than I imagined from a throwaway comment. I'm actually getting this to all primary schools. That's amazing. Yeah, great work. Just as I was about to wrap up, we get another question here by Robin concerning the church again. And do we know anything about the outcome of the ecclesiastical, I apologize, the church matter struggles over the tonsure that you mentioned, and any other features of the Celtic version of Christianity? Did they hang on in any way, or were they gradually completely replaced?
So in Cornwall specifically, there are hints, and I do say hints, is very sort of tangential stuff, that actually what we'll call Celtic practice did carry on up into the 10th century sort of thing. When we're talking about the church, it's sometimes useful to keep in mind that the diocese, or the see of Wessex, starts in Winchester, which is obviously quite a long way away. They eventually create Sherborne, which is a bit closer, and then it kind of eventually it's Exeter, and that's right on the doorstep, so to speak. And then, as we said, Athelstan invests in Bodmin and those kind of areas. So it's a kind of gradual shift, and we also, although it's a marking point for conflict, there's various synods. I don't actually know how to pronounce that, synods, where the church argues about this amongst themselves. It's quite a hot button issue in the earliest part of the period. I think it probably just eventually gets replaced by inertia, but I don't think we have a hard and fast date of that. As I say, the hints we have are that Cornwall does hang on slightly longer than others, possibly just because, as we've said, it's a little bit of a long way away from what eventually becomes the Roman Catholic power structures in Britain. And yeah, they kind of eventually, though, everyone is roughly in compliance, or as in compliance as the medieval Catholic Church ever was. We sometimes overstate how much of a monolithic being the Catholic Church was. Having been raised Catholic, I can attest that Catholics will argue with each other about pretty much anything if given the opportunity. So that has not historically changed.
Yeah, thank you. We've just had a comment by Michelle as well, talking about how one of the last bastions of the Easter dating, or the tonsure debate, did then conform eventually in 715. Yeah. So yeah, I think we've had a fantastic discussion. The questions seem to be slowing down, so I think it's a nice point to wrap it up as well. What we usually do at the end is I ask everyone to unmute themselves so that we can give you a round of applause, because it's really been a fascinating talk, and so much that we actually covered in discussion afterwards. So I'm going to invite everyone to unmute yourself just so we can thank you properly, John. Thank you very much.
Really, really interesting talk.
Oh, thanks
so
very much.
Much more in that.